Welcome back. You're tuned in to Live from Paris. I'm Rochelle Ferguson-Biahi. The top stories for you this hour. A terror investigation underway here in the French capital. Paris prosecutors ramp up their inquiries after a civilian police employee killed 4 of his colleagues in a deadly knife attack. Amid ongoing clashes between police and protesters, Hong Kong's embattled leader Carrie Lam introduces regulation banning face masks. Well, that measure is set to come into play on Saturday. Demonstrators, though, saying they'll defy the ban. Also coming up, deadly violence in the Iraqi capital as police open fire on people gathering for anti-government protests. At least 53 people are said to have been killed in demonstrations this week. But first to our top story. Here in France, prosecutors are opening a terror investigation after a civilian police employee fatally stabbed 4 of his colleagues at the Paris police headquarters on Thursday. Well, it comes after the prosecutor's office said it had found elements in relation with a terrorist enterprise. Meanwhile, the assailant's wife has said a day prior to the attack, her husband had had a psychotic episode, saying he heard voices. France 24's Erin Ergunke reports.
The murder of 4 officers at the Paris police headquarters has just taken on a new dimension. The attack will now be investigated as an act of terror.
Considering the different elements that investigators with the criminal brigade have gathered, on Friday the Anti-Terror Prosecutor's Office decided to take on the investigation into Thursday's incident at the police headquarters.
Officials are now probing the attacker for assassination and attempted assassination of a representative of public authority in connection with a terrorist enterprise. This despite the fact that the 45-year-old computer expert, who worked for the police since 2003, had never shown any behavioral problems, nor aroused any suspicions of radicalization. Earlier Friday, the Paris police chief even confirmed his recent transfer to the intelligence unit.
Like all, or at least many officers in that unit, he of course had a secret security clearance for matters of national defense. And I can only confirm at this stage that he had respected the obligations inherent to such a status.
Until Friday, investigators had been looking into whether the stabbings were linked to a psychotic fit. The attacker's wife, who has been in custody since Thursday, said he was acting incoherently and had heard voices the night before the attack.
Well, Paris was unsurprisingly shaken by that murderous stabbing spree in the heart of police headquarters this week. France 24's Sam Bradpriest takes a look back at exactly what happened.
At about 1 o'clock, an employee of the Paris police force raged through the prefecture headquarters, killing 3 officers and an administrative worker. Before he could strike further, he was shot dead by a rookie policeman inside the building's courtyard. The attacker had worked in the prefecture for 16 years as an IT technician.
This man was known in the IT department. He worked alongside his colleagues. He has never had any behavioral difficulties, never showed any alarming signs. But then this morning he committed this murderous act.
After Thursday's attack, roads were blocked, the area locked down and security personnel deployed. The assailant's wife was taken into custody immediately following the killings. She told police that her husband had heard voices in his head the night before. The investigation has since been handed over to the French anti-terror prosecutor.
Away from Paris, amid ongoing clashes between police and protesters in Hong Kong, the city's embattled leader Carrie Lam has introduced regulation banning face masks as of Saturday. Well, Lam's decision to evoke a colonial-era emergency comes as the city scrambles to stem months of violence. Speaking on Friday, she called the decision necessary at a time of, quote, critical danger for the financial hub. And that's a stance which China says it fully supports. Meanwhile, protesters have said they plan to defy the ban.
Defiant in the face of the imminent mask ban, thousands gathered in Hong Kong with their faces covered.
This would just make all of the Hong Kong people more unsatisfied about what the government's doing. It's just blaming that because of these masks, there are violence. And it's just not us.
We have our choice to wear the mask or don't wear the mask. And the Hong Kong police, they also also wearing the mask when they are doing their job. And they don't show their pass and their number. We can't complain there anymore.
Many protesters wear masks to hide their identity due to fears they could lose their jobs. Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam's latest strategy: make the demonstrators' faces identifiable and so get them off the streets. Lam announced the mask ban earlier on Friday as a response to a recent escalation of violence after 4 months of anti-government demonstrations, saying she would go to the legislature for legal backing to the rule.
We believe the prohibition on face-covering legislation will be an effective deterrent on radical behaviour, and it will also help the police enforce the law.
The ban doesn't officially come into effect until Saturday, imposed under a colonial-era emergency ordinance which hasn't been used in over 50 years. It enables the chief executive to bypass Parliament. Critics warn further clampdowns could be around the corner.
Next, there were scenes of violence in the Iraqi capital this Friday as police opened fire on people who'd rallied for anti-government protests. A crackdown began on Tuesday when security forces fired live rounds and tear gas to disperse protesters who were calling for better job opportunities and an end to corruption. Well, so far, at least 53 people have been killed in the unrest. The UN, meanwhile, has urged the Iraqi government to allow people to exercise their rights to freedom of expression. France 24's Emerald Maxwell brings you this report.
The sound of gunfire rings out in the virtually deserted streets of Baghdad as Iraqi security forces target the few protesters who have defied around-the-clock curfew. South of the Iraqi capital in Najaf, families have begun burying their relatives. Anti-government protesters who were met by police using water cannon, tear gas and live rounds.
He was martyred in a protest. He was calling for the rights of the people. He was 23 years old.
The nationwide demonstrations started spontaneously on Tuesday, mostly spurred by anger over endemic corruption in the oil-rich country and a lack of jobs and public services. The country's top cleric has called for calm, while also blaming authorities, and in particular lawmakers, for ignoring calls for reform.
Parliament bears the biggest responsibility in all this. If it doesn't change its ways and respond to the realistic demands for reform, then there will be no real change on the ground.
The UN also expressed concern at the crackdown on protesters.
We are worried by reports that security forces have used live ammunition and rubber bullets in some areas. We call on the Iraqi government to allow people to freely exercise their rights to freedom of expression and peacefully assembly.
The unrest is the most serious challenge yet for Abdul Mahdi's not-yet-year-old government. The Prime Minister has appealed for patience from protesters, saying he needed more time to implement reforms.
In Ecuador, clashes have erupted between protesters and police in the capital, Quito. On Thursday, President Lenin Moreno declared a state of emergency following demonstrations against rising fuel prices. Well, the demonstrations, which paralysed transport, were the biggest in a decade. More than 350 arrests have been made nationwide. Now, amid ongoing Brexit uncertainty, Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson will send a letter to the EU requesting a delay in case no deal is reached by October 19th. Well, that news comes according to documents submitted by a Scottish court. On Wednesday, Johnson gave new proposals to the EU, which he hopes will result in a deal for Britain to leave on October 31st. Well, despite the demand for an extension, Johnson insisted earlier that Britain will still have a timely exit from the EU.
A major revelation in a Scottish courthouse. According to government papers obtained by lawyers and read aloud, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson will abide by Parliament and seek an extension to the Brexit deadline of October 31st if he can't reach a deal with the EU by October 19th.
That has never been said before by the Prime Minister. He is now saying in these pleadings, or it is being said on his behalf by his legal representatives, presumably acting on instructions, that he will send a letter in the form of set out and scheduled to 2019 Act by no later than 19th October 2019.
It marks a departure from the public position of Boris Johnson, who has consistently claimed the UK will leave the EU by the end of the month.
That is why we are coming out of the EU on October the 31st, come what may.
Earlier this week, the British government submitted its latest Brexit proposal to the EU. It's been met with skepticism, and especially by Ireland. On Friday, the country's prime minister said he'd like an agreement to be reached later this month, but also prefers an extension of the deadline to a no-deal exit.
My preference is that we have that agreement at the Council in the middle of October. But if the UK government were to request an extension, I think we would consider that. Of course, we would consider it. Certainly, an extension would be better than no deal.
Talks aimed at securing a final Brexit agreement are slated to kick off in Brussels on October 17th.
Well, let's bring you some other world news now. Just 3 weeks after Tunisians rejected established political parties in the first round of presidential polls, voters are set to cast their ballots in parliamentary elections on Sunday. Well, some 7 million Tunisians are eligible to vote in a poll for which some 15,000 candidates are running on more than 1,500 lists. Well, this as they go head-to-head for 217 seats. Now, the parliamentary poll is the second since Tunisia's adoption of a new constitution back in 2014. Well, look, to shed some light on this, I'm joined here in the studio by Hamada Sharif Zine El Abdine, correspondent for the Tunisian paper France de la Maghreb.
Yes.
Welcome. Thanks for speaking to us this evening. First of all, going into these polls, I know you're not long back from Tunisia. What can you tell us about voter engagement? Are people as interested in these parliamentary elections as they were the presidential ones?
I don't think so, because on the 15th of September, we noticed a tremendous change in our political life, because 24 candidates out of 26 have been eliminated. Among them, the Prime Minister, 2 former Prime Ministers, 5 ministers of the government, and a lot of leaders of the opposition. And the 2 candidates for the presidency are new. They are not politicians, and this is something new for a young democracy.
I mean, as you say, some very big names surprisingly were kind of put aside within that first round of presidential elections. We saw Tunisians, crossing out, saying a big no to kind of ruling political elites, if you will. Can we expect them to stress the same kind of stance in these parliamentary polls?
I think so. Because if we think about what happened in 2018, we had 2 elections. One partial election in Germany, won by an independent against all the established politicians. The second was the local elections, and more than half of the winners were independent people, and we noticed a very a loss of penetration of the various parties from the right, from the left. The Islamists had in 2011 1.5 million of voters, and in 2014 they registered 900,000 only, and then last year they were like this year about 400,000 voters only, which means that even the parties who participated in the government, who know the complexity of the political side, who know how the governance of a young and poor country is difficult, these politicians are not able now to attract the voters. And this is why I think this is a wave, and it will continue. Tomorrow we will see that we will have new faces in the parliament. We will have new, maybe small lists of independents, but we still have the old system
in place.
Because
let's think, because I mean, sorry to interrupt you. You did touch on 2014 there. You know, it was a time 3 years on from the Arab Spring uprising. Tunisia was being hailed as a beacon of democracy.
Exactly.
You know, a number of years on, if we look at 2019 and we look at what took people out onto the streets, you know, not enough employment, an economy which, you know, was not doing particularly well. For somebody who's like you, who's been on the ground in Tunisia recently, what has changed concretely? What's been achieved since then?
Nearly nothing. Because the only freedom that we have got from the past is the freedom of expression. All other kind of freedom of rights are not established yet.
Is unemployment still an issue?
The employment, we have 15% of employment now. Maybe 30% among young people. We have 250,000 people graduated from university unemployed. This is a huge problem, and it has not been solved either by helping them find a job or helping them financially. Or this is a problem, and in this election, we have seen that these kind of people who are educated, they have their diploma, they are employed, they are acting within the system, the democratic system. They're not keen to do another revolution, but they know that with the polls they can go and vote and change the things. And this is new for everybody. Mm-hmm. It's new for the politicians, the old generation of politicians.
And the new ones.
And the new ones. And even for the public, because we are not used to it. It's the fourth free election organized from the revolution.
Hamada Sharif, Zina Al Abidine, as you say, new challenges ahead. Of course, those parliamentary polls set for Sunday. Thank you for joining us
Thank
here
you very
on
much.
France 24 today.